Hey everyone, I wanted to go over my predictions for the upcoming Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak digital event that's set to air on March 15th at 7 a.m. Pacific time and 10 a.m. East Coast time. I'm going to be splitting up the video in two specific sections. First, I'm going to talk about the things that we already know that are going to be talked about and shown in the event, thanks to the official Japanese Monster Hunter Rise Twitter blog that they posted. They went over in detail as to what things we can expect to see based on pretty much them teasing information, which they have been doing. And in the back end of the video, I'm going to talk about my personal predictions. So I'm going to timestamp the video so you can skip over directly to the monsters part, the section where I'm going to be talking about what monsters we can expect in Sunbreak, only because there's a lot of information that I'm going to go over. I don't have insider information, so Capcom, if you're watching, do not copyright strike my video. Please, just leave me alone. So starting out, you are going to see one of the newest things that they posted in their Twitter account in Japan, where they're basically showcasing a new image with Rondine and her sister as she's wearing basically Master Utsushi's mask, interestingly enough. And the translation for the tweet, it actually read, "Who's that person close to Rondine who actually helped the hunters in a difficult situation?" And of course, you're also going to be seeing on the screen the information that we got from the official blog, where they basically mentioned that we're going to be getting, of course, confirmation on the new story for Sunbreak, presumably them referencing of View the Hunter going to Elgato, which they also mentioned they're going to talk about the base Elgato and its unique characters. Now, I've talked about this before in the presentation reveal video that I made, where of course at the very least we know already of two of those characters being introduced, as we already have their voice packs. Essentially, you can purchase them right now on the eShop and on Steam via PC. You can buy those voice packs already. They're already part of the game. So we know that they're going to talk about the story, whatever that is ultimately going to be about. They're going to talk about Elgato, some of those mentions for the unique brand new characters. They're also talking about unseen monsters, which I'm going to talk about at the back end of the video, like I said, timestamped. And of course, new fields. This was one of the things that really stuck out to me the most, because even as I looked at all the translations, and other people did pick up on this as well, so shout out and credit to them as well, as they picked up on it, that they are saying plural areas will be added into the game, as in multiple, more than one. So we have seen at the very least one with the castle, which we talked about in the Malzeno first look video that I made just a couple of days ago, as I'm talking about it. And they're basically mentioning like, hey, this castle area of ruins is just one of multiple areas surrounding, you know, where Malzeno has been spotted. So even if their very own Malzeno description, they talk about multiple areas. So they are teasing a lot when it comes to this kind of stuff. What ultimately that number of areas will be, no one necessarily knows for sure, but what we can expect is at the very least the bulk of those areas to be something along the lines of arenas. So if you think of like the arena itself, you know, the place where you fight like Narwa and the other arena they introduced, basically where you have very specific fights in that area, that is where we can expect the bulk of the areas to be. I don't think they're going to give us like 5 brand new maps or anything along those lines. That would just be unrealistic, and it wouldn't be something that they've done in the past. Remember that Iceborne was just one big massive explorable area and then a bunch of smaller arenas. That's usually what they have done in the past. And that's what I can't stress enough, the fact that when we start talking about monsters that are going to be returning, new monsters and stuff like that, you need to start looking at the concept of like what they have done in the past, and basically it will illuminate the future for you. That's kind of like, if they've done it before, they might do it again. So if you actually start to look at like how many new monsters, that would be including such species, have been added into previous Monster Hunter games, from Monster Hunter World to Monster Hunter Iceborne, they included 18 new monsters, quote unquote, including such species. When they went from Generations to Generations Ultimate, they added 8 new monsters, again including such species. From Monster Hunter 4 to Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, they included 12 new monsters. From Monster Hunter 3 to Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, that was 10 new monsters, again, such pieces included. From Monster Hunter 2 to Monster Hunter Freedoms and Freedoms Unite, so that would be uniting both of those games together, they included 13 new monsters. So what is the telltale here? They go from 13 to 10 to 12 to 8 to 18. Iceborne had the most amount of new monsters added in of any of the prior games. So if we're going to be realistic about this, and we're going to say, hey, let's be optimistic and say they're going to add 20 monsters, including such species, into Sunbreak. Well, that would be the most, first and foremost, of any prior Monster Hunter games pretty much ever. But then there's also the caveat that we understand, and we need to understand, that that 20 number basically needs to be broken down in 3 specific areas. One would be subspecies, since we now subspecies are going to be making their way into the game, or at the least variants, which are a different version of subspecies. Number 2, new monsters, brand new never introduced monsters like Luna Garen and Malzeno, which you already know 2 of them. And then returning monsters, which we know at the very least Shogun Senator to be one of them. So then when they spoke about returning monsters, let's remember this was one of the very first things that they teased, was that the monsters that they were going to be returning are like pretty iconic to the series. So we're not going to be expecting, you know, a basic like any old monster. It has to be something that's like relevant to the series, or at the very least to the developer's eyes. And when it comes to subspecies, that can be broken down into 2 specific areas. First and foremost, subspecies for monsters which are already included into the game. So that would be something along the lines of like a Ruby Basarios or a Black Diablos, meaning again, the base monster is already in the game. Therefore, the subspecies making it into the game makes a lot of sense. And then of course, new subspecies being added into the game for monsters that didn't necessarily exist before. This is where you get the brand new subspecies for Bishaten, for example, which would be, you know, a brand new monster as they consider it. So it makes me think like, well, what other of the new monsters, which were 13 monsters, were added into Monster Hunter Rise? That's the total of monsters, not including apexes, that were added into Rise. Well, what are the chances that Magnum Alo doesn't get a new subspecies? I think that's a pretty realistic expectation that Magnum Alo would get one. Well, what other monster would get one? Probably Tetranodon. That's a pretty popular monster that they've added in. That's probably one of those subspecies. So this is what I say, where like when you start to break down, like if the number of monsters being 20, that's a realistic number if we're being optimistic about it. And then you start to break down how many of those are going to be subspecies, how many of those are going to be new monsters, and how many of those are going to be returning monsters. Then you can't really realistically have this like massively long list of monsters that are going to be returning or being added in or new subspecies, when it's just, you have to be looking at the numbers based on what they've done in the past and what they can do in the future. So with all that table setting out of the way, and I apologize if you already zoned out, but that was just, I'm trying to make sense of this only because I think it's very important for you guys to understand just how the numbers don't necessarily add up if people are expecting too many new monsters. It's just not what Capcom does, so we shouldn't expect that here. So when it comes to subspecies, the ones that we can probably realistically expect out of this pool of monsters that I'm going to mention is things like Fulgore Anjanath and Viper Tobi Kadachi. These were monsters that were in Iceborne. We can expect those to maybe make an appearance, but again, it would really boil down to how realistically Capcom views them as important or relevant to the series. Then we have things like Stygian Sonogre, which I do think it's extremely important. That monster, alongside Azure Rathalos, Silver Rathalos, Pink Rathian, and Gold Rathian, have always kind of been like a staple. So if we're realistically thinking that, let's say subspecies make up 10 of the 20 monsters that are going to be added in, again, subspecies are included in those new monsters, that would be like 5 already gone. And I don't think they're realistically going to add Azure and Silver and Pink and Gold Rathian. That would be too many, you know, Rathalos and Rathians. So they would just probably pick a pair. And then Stygian Sonogre realistically is a super popular monster that they could easily add in. We're also looking at things like Black Diablos. Diablos is in the game. Black Diablos has been somewhat relevant in the past. That could be added in. Red Kezu is also an interesting one, only because the introduction of Kezu was a really popular one. And even in the most recent video that they did, where they put out like the Kezu 4K version, that one got a lot of views. Like, people really like Kezu for whatever weird reason that is. So, you know, that Red Kezu being added in would be something interesting. Sand Barrieth and Ruby Bozarios are in the lesser tier of returning monsters that are subspecies, only because realistically speaking, they're not all that popular. But again, those base versions of those monsters are already in the game. I would probably say the same thing about Rusted Kushala Daora, but it is Kushala Daora that is a pretty important monster in the series, and the Rusted version did seem to be like a whole heck of a lot of challenge. And when we start looking at subspecies, there aren't that many Elder Dragons that have subspecies, so that's something worth considering. Crimson Glow Valstrax, in fact, is kind of like one of those same tier type of monsters, so it would be interesting to consider Rusted Kushala Daora as a subspecies Elder Dragon, probably getting in only because of that. We're also looking at things like Silverwind Nargacuga and Lucent Nargacuga. It would only have to be one of them, but Nargacuga, it is extremely popular monster. So Silverwind, I think, is the more realistic one because it has been released in one of the more recent games. But other than that, you know, in the same way that you can consider things like Brute Tigrex and Molten Tigrex. Very popular monster. Tigrex is pretty much a staple in every Monster Hunter game, kind of like Rathalos. But, you know, they would have to just pick one, realistically speaking. Then we can look at things like Coral Puke Puke and Purple Ludroth. Again, bottom tier kind of a thing of such species. Not necessarily all that popular, and at the end of the day, they're just kind of like not really all that difficult monsters. So if we're really going to add such species, there are way better versions of those monsters, or at the very least other monsters that could be worth considering to be brought in. Then we start to get into the discussion of like, what are the returning monsters look like? And there's basically a small short list that I basically boiled down, and it starts with Samtrios, Agnanctor, and Boldrome, and for very good reasons. All of those three monsters were suspected to be part of Monster Hunter Rise's original release. People expected those because they had been mentioned in leaks and stuff like that prior to the game releasing. So them now finally appearing in the game would be something that fans would be like, yeah, there was data already in the game for them. It makes a whole heck of a lot of sense for them to appear. I'm going to mention Palomalu only because it is the only realistic monster that I still see appearing for Monster Hunter World, making its way onto Rise. There aren't that many left that you can realistically expect, other than like stuff that was added in Iceborne post-launch. But even that would not necessarily be all that popular to begin with. When we start to consider returning monsters have to be staples to the series, and Palomalu is anything but that. What is a staple of the series, however, is Devil Joe and Kurupeko. Kurupeko is extremely popular and they have not utilized it in quite a while. And of course, Devil Joe is Devil Joe. That's like a super popular monster that people adore. So those two appearing together, I think that would be a really good sign of things to come. But realistically speaking, Kurupeko, we haven't seen it in quite a while, and Devil Joe, I think, is almost a guarantee, if not a sure shoo-in, to be appearing in Sunbreak. Then we have things like Giginox and Daimyo Hematar. Giginox is a monster that I keep seeing people post that they want to see back, but because they added Kezu, I don't necessarily see Giginox making a return. Daimyo Hematar, however, I think has a much better case because Shogun Hematar is already in the game. We already know that's going to be appearing. So Daimyo without Shogun doesn't really make a lot of sense. So if one had to get in, the other one has to get in. That's the way that I'm seeing it. Then we have things like Seregios. I think Seregios is an extremely popular monster. If they're really saying that the monsters that are going to be returning are popular and fan favorites, Seregios is an easily shoo-in, just kind of like Devil Joe. You kind of have to put him in because he's extremely popular. You can say the same thing about Kirin. Kirin is an Elder Dragon that simply is just almost in every game. So if you're going to put him in, makes the most amount of sense. You're also looking at things like Lunastra, which was already in World and Iceborne, and you already have Teostra in the game. So those are like two pretty easy tells that Lunastra, I think, would be one of those shoo-ins for those 20 new monsters being added in. We're also, of course, looking at something like Gore Magala and Shagaru Magala. And I think people are demanding for this monster to come back. It is just one of those things that people are just trying to make it happen no matter what. Kind of like Lagiacrus is just one of those two monsters that people just keep asking over and over, please bring it back. And Gore Magala is extremely popular. If they're realizing that, you know, the audience wants something, they should definitely bring it back. Now, the monster that I'm going to specifically say I think is a sure shoo-in for Sunbreak would be Amatsu. This is a monster that I believe was introduced in Monster Hunter 3 Portable, I want to say. That was the first time that it was introduced into the game. And I think it's just one of those monsters that fits in perfectly and exactly with what kind of like the story is for, you know, Monster Hunter Rise. You know, you have Ibushi and Narwa kind of fitting that same narrative of monsters kind of like alone, looking for their place, looking for each other, and Amatsu kind of just fits into that same narrative as well. It also certainly doesn't help that it's a flying, you know, weird body type of monster that is just not like anything else we had seen before. So Amatsu to me is almost like a shoo-in. I hope I'm right, but at the end of the day, those are pretty much the monsters that I think, if we're going to talk about returning monsters making an appearance, I think that's the most realistic list I could come up with. And then, of course, the such species making a comeback, I think is going to be the bulk of that, you know, roster. So then it boils down, if we're really going to get 20 new monsters specifically, if we're looking at the numbers, and I hope I'm being optimistic on this, if 10 of those are going to be such species, returning monsters are probably going to be half of that. What are we really looking at new monsters? That would be probably maybe 4 to 5 to 6, you know, and we already know 2 of them. So it would be one of those things that maybe people are going to be disappointed at the end of the day of how many new monsters are going to be appearing, but they can certainly make up on that if they can give us returning monsters or such species that people actually care about. And ultimately, they do the right thing by giving us Apex monsters, which I didn't even talk about. Apex monsters and Apex armors that people actually care about. I honestly wouldn't sit here and speculate that they're going to rely on the Rampage all that much any longer. I have a video that I'm going to talk about the Rampage, like where does it actually fall into like Sunbreak's original story and what they're going to do. I'm waiting for them to actually show us and give us more information on the game so we can actually see if the Rampage is even going to matter, because I personally don't believe it is. I don't even think it's something that they're going to tackle anymore, but I could be completely wrong. We're just going to have to wait and see. But that's going to be pretty much it for this video. I just wanted to give over like pretty much my predictions on what we can expect to see, and pretty much like a broken down list of like what the realistic scenario looks like for monsters going forward that are going to be introduced in Sunbreak. If you are brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.